Well, we're going to record this and we're going to ask you some questions. And we sent you the list of questions, and then afterwards we'll just talk a little bit, okay? What did you want to be when you were a little girl?
I guess I would say, what did I want to be? How little is little? I guess I grew up thinking I'd be a nurse, which I was.
What influenced your life that made you just naturally think, I'm going to be a nurse?
I think it was the era of the time, what the options were for women, for young women, a teenager I was at that time. It was very limited to what female children should and could do. So I think that was one of the influences. And I think the other influence was I was born into family violence, and my mother eventually left and left for good. And as a consequence, she went to work to support myself and my brother and herself. And women at that time were paid very little, so we were poor. And I remember thinking that nursing at that time if I entered nursing, I could do that early, and it would be less of a financial burden on my mother. So that was also very much an influence. I had been offered a scholarship to go to university, but I realized I had no financial means, and the scholarship didn't cover everything. So there were limitations financially. So I would say those are the two biggest influences, being born female and what society conditioned, if you will, little girls to think about being, and the state of my mother and poverty.
And how's that translated into your life today?
Well, I think I've never forgotten my roots, and working with women who have suffered family violence and especially torture and human trafficking. Many of them are poor, and many of them struggle, and I can relate to that. I've never forgotten what my own roots were, so it gives me that insight. And I think I remember very clearly growing up when I invited friends to our home or the place where we lived, because originally my mother could only afford to rent 2 rooms, so we lived in 2 rooms. And I remember some of my friends coming, and I can still remember their response of being shocked at how limited our living was. And so I guess feeling that discrimination, it really never took it personally, because I figured that was their issue. I was very thankful to be away from my father. So what it has done, it's also helped me be very acutely aware of injustice and the discrimination and the stigma that women that Linda McDonald and I work with, I can relate to how they're feeling about that. And also it gives me strength to let them know that that's an injustice, and it's not theirs to carry. It belongs to society and to the otherization that goes on. So that's been an important influence in the work that I do.
So could you talk a little bit about the work that you do and how wanting to be a nurse has influenced that?
Well, I think when I think about nursing and the work of non-state torture, it's been very helpful, and the women have told us that. And I think it's because Number one, because their socialization has been so harmed to the advantage of the torturers. For example, I can be very specific. One of the tactics of the torturers is bestiality, and women were often told that they would have monster babies, half human and half animal, if you will. And they were always too shame-based and humiliated to discuss this. But for us, it seemed that it was okay because they said our nursing, they realized we could probably explain the anatomy and the physiology and the biology of it, which we did repeatedly, and it helped them let go of their fears that what the torturers told them was true. So that was how nursing really helped in the work that we do. And also, for me, being connected to people who were in perpetual crisis, even physically in hospital, and watching how they disconnected or disassociated as a way of coping, and understanding that they could only heal so fast. Their mind could only take in so much at a time. That gave me a lot of patience to wait for women who were tortured and who were unraveling the dissociation survival responses that kept them alive, that I had to just wait as their brain kept unraveling at the rate that they could cope with. So it gave me a lot of patience and perseverance that way. And I also worked multiculturally. I lived in the Canadian Arctic and worked with within Aboriginal communities, and lived there too, often in isolation. Coming to know that non-state torturers could be our neighbors and yet have a secret way of living, I think prepared me just to be able to travel into the non-state torture co-culture without getting overwhelmed. So that was an advantage too, plus my own childhood experiences.
Could you just explain briefly about what you mean by non-state torture, because that isn't a term that I find common in the U.S. in terms of describing behavior, especially around domestic violence.
Yeah, non-state torture, it was an evolutionary process for Linda and I, because the first woman that came to us was in 1993. And very quickly, she started unraveling her victimizations. And Linda and I quickly knew that this was not assault and it was not abuse. I mean, she was talking about electric shocking and being hung and burnt and caged and torture raped, electric shocking of her vagina and her mouth and her breasts, and being cut and burnt. And so for us in 1993, when we looked to the literature, looked to see how we could define what we were hearing, the only place we could look was at the torture literature. And when we looked at information on torture through Amnesty International and the Red Cross and UN reports, they were listing acts of torture that were the same that the first woman was saying she had endured. So at that time, when the first woman came, society, she was also saying that there was ritualized group processes. So she came and said it was ritual abuse torture. So that's where we went, because we had no previous understanding of what torture, victimization in the domestic private sphere was. So we realized we had to have a definition if we were going to deal with what the woman was disclosing. So ritual abuse torture was the first terminology that came, and to find out if the first woman's story could be recaptured by other women telling the same or similar story, in 1998 we decided to put out a message in Nova Scotia if other women felt they were tortured, would they talk to us? So 5 other women came, and out of those 5, 3 identified the very same way as the first woman did, had the same torture tactics and the same perpetrator's MO was very much the same. And so then we decided, well, if we're making sense, we better push ourselves further. So we ended up in Connecticut at a conference where we heard that people attended had also survived what they call ritual abuse and torture. So we presented there and thought, well, we'll go and we'll see if we make any sense. And if we don't make sense, then we'll have to backtrack. And if we make sense, then we'll keep pushing forward. That this is a new form of violence that some women and female children, we don't have enough knowledge about male children. We know they're harmed, but we don't know how, because only a few men have ever contacted us. Anyway, we got there and we ended up talking about the human right of non-state torture. Well, at that time it was ritual abuse torture, that it was a human rights violation and involved torture. And we had a standing ovation. So the model that we presented obviously made sense. So in closing our presentation, had put up that we had a dream to go to the UN, because by this time we had also realized that the UN, the issue that women and girls could be tortured within a family or trafficked and tortured, that the torture of women and girls as a human rights violation that happened by individuals and individuals within a group, which is what non-state torture is. We learned that it wasn't being named as a form of violence against women and girls, a distinct form of violence separate from assault, separate from abuse, separate from domestic violence, in the sense that domestic violence is seen as abuse or assault. So when we got to the UN in 2004, an NGO had asked us to present on their panel. Linda and I went hunting for answers, because we went there I'm trying to make this simple and not too confusing, but by the time 2004, when we got to the UN, what had happened before that, which I have to backtrack a little, was that a woman that Linda, in her nursing, came in contact with, and that Linda and I privately ended up working with, had married a man who had groomed her without her knowing. He had a plan that he would hold her captive, traffic her, and torture her. And this was a plan that he devised with 3 other his friends in another community from the community she lived in. And she lived in the community that Linda and I lived in. Anyway, she married this man, and he became violent. And then 6 months into the marriage, said, well, maybe we should go to Ontario. And she thought, well, we'd start a new life. But the new life he had planned was when they landed at the airport, the other men were there, and they threw her in the car and kept her captive in a windowless room where they tortured her and trafficked her for 4.5 years until she managed to escape. So by that time, we realized that ritual abuse torture didn't fit. So we called the ritual abuse torture as a form of non-political torture because the torturers were family members, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, neighbors, traffickers, strangers that they were trafficked to. So we called it non-political because the only other knowledge we had was the state torture and the crimes were the same. So when we got to the UN in 2004 and went looking for more answers, we were told in no uncertain terms that non-political torture was incorrect, that everything that women suffer, including torture, is political. It's always political. The situation of women and girls within patriarchal society. So we were told that Amnesty International had written a booklet in the year 2000 on non-state actors, defining that that we had to have a terminology for individuals who committed atrocities that were not government people. They were non-state actors. They were private individuals, and they were paramilitary groups. So Amnesty created this term of non-state actors. So that's when we put the term non-state torture, we realized was the term that we had to be using based on what Amnesty International had written and what the UN terminology now was. So it was an evolution for us from 1993 until the year 2004 that the terminology went from ritual abuse torture, which is now a form of non-state torture because it defines the MO of those perpetrators, to spousal torture, which defines the torture that some women suffer at the hands of their partner. So that was the non-political that we thought was the term, to the evolution that all of these fit under the terminology of non-state torture, which is now a human rights terminology. That terminology was validated in 2007 at the United Nations, the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, because Linda and I were there, and the main theme in 2007 was to eliminate all forms of discrimination and violence against the girl child. And we, along with other women NGO, were successful in having it named that torture of children happens, say in human trafficking and exploitation, which is a form of non-state torture. So it is coming. It is coming. And I know for Linda and I, when we first did our first panel at the UN CSW in 2004, it was the first time I think such a panel on non-state torture was ever presented. But this year we were there for another panel, and the whole issue of non-state torture was being talked about by women who were exploited into prostitution, that were tortured by their parents as little babies, and for us, our own experience as being supporters of women who were talking about their different forms of torture, whether that was pornographic victimization that involved torture, whether it was prostitutive exploitation that involved torture, whether it was spousal torture for the women who were born into families that tortured and trafficked them.
So let me.
That's a long story.
It is a long story. Well, the thing that is really inspiring to me about it, having come from a torture relationship, is that the language, this is something I've said from the beginning of my career, is that we still don't have enough language to really accurately speak about these experiences and to bring them into the mainstream. So, the thing that you're not talking about, which maybe I'm just reading into this, is that you were people basically saying, the story about the emperor has no clothes, and it occurred to me that much of the work that many of us have done, we've sort of been in that position where we've said, okay, we don't see that guy has clothes on. We're like, this is really the real place. So anyway, but I was wondering when all this was going on, when you were identifying these situations and women were coming forward, and then you went to the panel in Connecticut and you got the standing ovation. I just wondered how that felt and if that was some kind of defining moment for you.
A couple things. First I'll respond to the use of language. Now, the women, a consequence of us, Linda and I, persevering around getting the right name for the victimizations that the women were experiencing. Women consistently and continuously tell us that what has been so valuable is their ability to start naming the crime that they suffered and describing it with the language that we've eventually created, explained, so that they could tell their stories and understand themselves in a way that is no longer confusing. Yeah, that has been crucial, and they tell us that all the time. So what that has done, it has moved them from the fear of being crazy, or naked, if you will, into developing a firm relationship with themselves, knowing that they can explain themselves in language that is understandable to others. As to the defining moment, when they stood up and did that, it's funny that if I think about that emotionally, whether I thought it was a defining moment or not, because Linda and I'm writing the book for Linda and I and our experiences at the moment, and what comes to me, when we got on the plane to go to Connecticut, I was sitting on the plane and I looked at Linda and I said, well, this is going to be a journey, because if we don't make sense to them, what's going to happen? What are we going to do then? And what will happen to the first woman that we're supporting and the other women we've talked to in our kitchen table research project here in Nova Scotia, And like Linda said, she hadn't even thought about it. She just thought we were just going to go there and have success and move on. So I dropped this bombshell on her that maybe it wouldn't turn out that way. So she calls it my airplane bombshells. Did I do it? I repeat it without being apparently too aware of where she was thinking about it. I was just thinking about it in my way. I don't know if it was a defining moment, or whether, I think the work that Linda and I were doing by that time and had started in 1993, we were so undercover because we could not find any support anywhere for the woman. Once people realized, when we said this woman has been tortured, does anybody in this province have the skill to help her? And nobody would touch it, and we were unable to say anything because it felt that if we said too much publicly or professionally, it put us at risk of being discredited. So more and more it seemed that we were working undercover and very much alone and very silenced in the process. And because the woman was so suicidal, because that's how she called saying she was going to commit suicide in 4 days. And she wasn't at a stage of understanding why she was suffering like she was. I think by the time the standing ovation in Connecticut came, I was still in that stage of wondering whether we could continue to move forward or what. So I guess your question, since it doesn't hit me like that, it couldn't have been a feeling I had at the time. Linda says, as soon as I have a little success, I go into the next stage of work. So I think that's where I went. I went into, okay, what's the next stage? Because putting up the overhead that had a dream of going to a UN, and a woman in the audience came up and said she was an NGO and would make this happen. I went right into, okay, that's the next stage. So maybe that's the difference. I think that I have defining moments, but apparently that is not one that hits me.
Well, I totally appreciate your style of management of your life. So tell me about a time that you do remember a defining moment.
I think some of the most defining moments are seeing the success of women who we've supported that have come so harmed. You know, like women have come saying they're shattered like a mirror thrown on the ground, shattered into just a million pieces. And some women don't even know they had skin, did not even know they had a physical body per se, because that was their survival disassociation, to keep disassociating until they really fail to exist physically as a human being. I think I get chills even thinking about it, that to know that that's how they come, and if they stay with the process, which is hard work for them and hard work for us, to come out and know that they're human beings, and to know that they had human rights, and they had the human right not to be subjected to torture, which is Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which every article in the Universal Declaration was to be a goal of the human species. So Article 5 was not just a human right privilege, if you will, to individuals who were state tortured. It was a right for everyone, regardless of who the torturer was. But patriarchy did not operationalize it in that way. It operationalized it that women and girls were not tortured. They were always collateral damage, maybe, or something. But anyway, I think those are my defining moments, my most defining moments. And to see women, Linda and I have been able to invite women to the UN to be on panels because NGOs have supported their speaking. To see them standing there speaking when they were almost wordless in the beginning, I think those are the most defining moments. Because I'm a writer, which I really did not spend much time thinking about until getting into this work and realize that I write and am a writer, I think some defining moments were when articles were published that kept breaking the silence, because in '93 we could find nothing, absolutely nothing, and for years we could find nothing that would validate these were women's stories. They're not victims. These are women's lived stories. Women are trying to tell these stories about what it means to be a woman. If by the roll of the dice you're born into families that enjoy torturing, or you marry somebody who enjoys torturing, I think every time there was something published that was a defining moment. And some of the publications are more defining than others because I guess they're getting a broader support. You know, they're getting further afield. So the hope is that at least the young people coming up who are still at risk or are being tortured, because Linda and I had a call from a young woman in the U.S. not just a few weeks ago who's just in her 20s, who's starting to cope with the memories. And she has a daughter And we know from our 26 years that there's an intergenerational risk. If women don't understand early enough what they've been subjected to because of their disassociation, women have, listening to their stories, we know that their children were harmed because they didn't understand what they had suffered as children, and when they had children themselves, their own children were placed at risk. So a defining moment are every time we get something published, and regardless of whether it's a newsletter or whether it's in an international book chapter. And last year, I was on a panel at the CSW that was supported by ambassadors from 3 different countries that released a book on the gender perspectives on torture, law, and practice. So I talked about the chapter that Linda and I and another co-author had in the book. I think to be seated on a panel that was being supported by ambassadors from 3 different countries gave the weight to the issue, and even the title of the book on gender perspectives on torture is showing how the discrimination that women and girls have suffered around the issue of silencing their torture that's perpetrated in any way by any perpetrator, whether they're state or not state. The silencing of the non-state torture is being challenged more and more. So I found that that was a defining moment last year to be part of that panel to talk about the work that Linda and I have done.
So tell us a little bit about your book and what's the title of it?
Well, the title I can't share yet because we don't know what the publisher. It still has to go through the publisher. The publisher has the final word. So he said we sent him the first 4 chapters, or the agent did, and he came back and said it was compelling. But for me, I never know for sure until I have it in hand whether it will become a reality. So what they've asked us to do, though, I can explain, is they've asked to tell our story about what our 26 years of working on breaking the silence about non-state torture was like, and also to include some of our own historical experiences. So we have both. We have our journey with the first woman, because of course her story is very much our story, because we had to, it was groundbreaking work we had to do because we had no models to follow, so we had to create the models that we needed to understand her victimization and then her consequential traumas and how to help her exit from the perpetrators, her family she was born into, and others, they're like-minded others, as well as to try to recover, because she was a professional woman and almost 30 and she was still captive, even though she worked at her professional job. Her disassociation, it was like she lived in 2 worlds, in the outside world, as they called it, and her insider world, which tragically she had been conditioned to believe that it was the best possible family world there was. So here we were trying to help her exit, trying to recover, but also trying to work with her to realize what her family perpetrators really were doing. And she'd have to decide to leave them, which was difficult too, because they were the only relationship she ever knew. Some of the women that we worked with, of course, they were fortunate and ended up with supportive partners that gave them some space. But for this first woman, she was totally surrounded by perpetrators, and that was all she knew. So even though she came suicidal and fatally victimized, she did not understand that this was why she was suffering. It took her quite a few years, almost between 5 and 7 years, to really understand what had happened to her.
Well, what are your plans as an activist as you age?
Well, I guess we keep doing what we're doing.
Okay, that sounds great. Good, well done, Jeanne. That's the right answer.
Yeah, that's right. You know, like Linda and I were involved in a research project a while ago. It was on the study of older adults. They wanted to know what happens to older adults' cognitive abilities following major surgery and anesthetic. So we said a daughter of Linda's friend was one of the researchers, and they were looking for candidates. So we said, okay, we'll help her out. We'll be one. But anyway, one of the questions they had is something like the question you're asking. They asked it a little bit differently, like, do you still enjoy the things now that you used to enjoy when you were young, like 25? I said, sure. Well, the things I did at 25, I am certainly not doing them now, you know.
Yes, I hope not.
Yeah, I hope not. I'm not having babies anymore, and I'm not raising little children, and so she says to me, geez, nobody ever said that to me in this research project. I said, well, she said, could you tell me more? Because even for myself, she said, I'd like to know this. I said, well, really, I can tell you that back in 1965, I was in the Arctic on an island learning to skin seals. Well, I'm not doing that anymore, you know. I might be painting my house, but I'm not skinning seals. That's what that means. As we age, you know, we may be doing different things. So I'm doing things. I'm writing now, which I wasn't doing when I was 25. Anyway, she said, oh, that's important. That's important for me to know. She said, because I'll keep that in mind when I'm older. I said, well, that's good. Good that you asked.
Yeah, we need to be having those conversations, because that's really kills the stereotype of as we age that we're supposed to be in a home somewhere twiddling our thumbs and waiting to die. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so
we were so upset.
Yeah.
The ageism is terrible.
Yeah. In fact, recently I decided to participate in a women's medical study, just because I knew I would just blow everybody out of the water, because I don't have a medical doctor and I don't take any medication. And then every time at the end of the phone conferences, they would say, oh, thank you, Annie, so much for being on the call, because we learned so much from you about aging. And I was like, wait, you are supposed to be the experts. And they're like, no, we're learning from you. So, yeah, another conversation we need wording for, so language. But anyway, just to sort of come to the end of the formal discussion of what we're doing, is what do you think is the best advice that you received, and if you did receive good advice, how did you put it to practice or use it?
I think I don't remember having a lot of good advice. I only remember being very young and because of the family situation, realizing that if I was going to survive, I had to do it on my own. Even though my mother cared, she could only cope with so much once she left. So I always grew up knowing that that was okay, that it was okay to take care of myself. So I guess I gave myself that advice. I was involved in elder care. I developed an elder care program some years ago, and it was a volunteer nursing program in a seniors complex to help seniors think about being healthy. And it got some attention. And there was a nurse that came, and she said to me, "Well, you don't have a degree. How can you do this work?" I had gone through the 3-year training program when I first entered nursing. So that kind of pissed me off. So I looked at her and I thought, okay, if that's the issue, I guess I'm going to do something about it. So in that sense, I think I had always wanted to go to university, but her statement, I still remember it, and it probably was part of the trigger that I ended up going for an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, and then I wanted to go for a PhD, but when I went to the nursing department, they pretty well kicked me out and said, kicked Linda and I both out, because they said, well, they didn't want to deal with the issues of non-state torture, so that was the end of the conversation. Anyway, can you tell me what happens with all the work that you're doing now with this project?
Well, we're not really sure exactly what happens, but we have a good vision. And we have lots of chutzpah, and we're easily pissed off, so we can be pushed further along. But the goal, first of all, the goal for us was to come back together as women who've worked together and love each other and wanted to have a project together, that we'd have fun.
Okay.
And we realize in our careers that everything that we have really focused on has been really trying hard to nourish other women and girls who are activists, because we didn't want to be alone ourselves. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's very, very selfish. The work we all do is selfish. It's like you're saying, you come from a place of knowing what this feels like, and you want to do something about it. And anyway, so we decided we were going to make a book where we could do the old-fashioned thing of telling women's stories that have been activists. We call them accidental activists. And we've had a grand time starting to pull everything together. So it's going to have a lot of interesting things that we think are interesting. Maybe nobody else will, but we did have some women that we've worked with in the past who are like judges and psychologists and friends, to look at some of the prototype that we were thinking, and they thought it was a great idea. But we're going to have coloring pages, with coloring pencils or markers, that have positive sayings, and we're going to have tear out sections where you could make a poster of something you want to remind yourself of. We're going to have healthy fast food recipes. What am I forgetting? So there are lots of things, different kinds of stories, different kinds of activities, some real nourishing activities. And these are all things that we've developed during our careers. So we're not even really having to invent very much. So, and we're feeling like we're going to use social media and we won't be using a publisher like you're doing, because we want control over all of it. And I also write, and so I understand self-publishing, and we use Ingram Sparks, because then we can publish books all over the world and have them delivered pretty easily without worrying about country barriers and stuff. And so we'll see. We don't know what is going to happen, but the number one thing is we're going to have fun. So, well, the world is tough, and it's challenged for me. I'm also a farmer, and I can't get out and about too much with it. I have to kind of stay where I am in order to keep doing activist work, because it just gets worse and worse. I don't really think things have gotten better for women and girls I just think we're able to find more words that we can talk, language that we can talk about it. And anyway, but so Dianne is reminding me with a note that that we just want to let you know how it's going to work. We're not sure how many stories we're going to use, but we're hoping to interview at least 12 women, and we're on track to do that. And they come from a variety of experiences. And this is why we wanted to interview you and Linda separately, because we feel like you each have a different version of the story, and we'd like to hear that. And then when we decide exactly how the book's going to come together and which women's voices that we want to hear in the book, we will send you a contract inviting you to participate with a small fee. And because everybody deserves to be paid for what they do, even though we're at the point of winding down the foundation, so we're not rich in money, but we have a little bit, and we're going to share it. And then yeah, well, that's what we need to do. And then we hope these will become podcasts, so women can hear the full interviews. And we'll at some point come back and do a video around the key points that we're going to use in the story in the book. So we have several pieces that we can dish out, and then the hope is to raise some money from that, and maybe that will help us to tell more stories, or maybe we'll just give it to all the women that are in the book. I don't know. Right now we're just thinking, how do we put the book together? So we're getting together a couple of times a year and working our buns off for about 3 or 4 days, and it's coming together, and I think we're pretty excited about it, actually.
We are.
So anyway, we'll be anxious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it sounds exciting. And women's stories, it's time for women's stories to be out there front and center, so great for you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And thank you taking my late call, because I have a son visiting with his family that I don't see very often, so I wasn't sure, but it was a good day to do it.
Oh,
so
that's lovely.
Everyone.
Oh, well, you're welcome, and thank you for all you're doing. But I just want to tell you the title of the book in case you have any feedback. We have the potential title is The Women's Accidental Activist Toolkit, and then it has a line that says, "A book of ways to say hell no."
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, hell no. Yeah. That's good.
Okay, good. Well, if you think of something else, let us know, and then we'll be back with you when we get ourselves organized, and we'll keep you up to date, okay?
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanne. You're so inspiring.